Good morning, boys and girls. It's Friday today, and today we are going to read Mr. Nonsense. So, Mr. Nonsense is a bit like Mr. Silly. He does very silly things. So, I think this story is going to be a great one today. Mr. Nonsense. Mr. Nonsense had no sense at all. Not a scrap. I mean, he lived in a tree. A tree? Can you imagine? Why do you live in a tree? Mr. Happy asked him one day. Because, replied Mr. Nonsense, I tried living on the ground, but that was too high up. So I moved to a tree to be nearer to the ground. What nonsense, snorted Mr. Happy. Thank you, replied Mr. Nonsense. And do you know what Mr. Nonsense liked to eat? Porridge. Nothing wrong with that, you might say, but porridge on toast? Really? Why do you like porridge on toast? Mr. Nosey asked him one day. Because, replied Mr. Nonsense, I tried porridge sandwiches and I didn't like them. And do you know where Mr. Nonsense sleeps every night? In a rowing boat in his bedroom, in his house, up a tree. It's actually quite a cool bed, isn't it? Why do you sleep in a rowing boat? Mr. Strong asked him one day. Because, replied Mr. Nonsense, I tried sleeping in a motor boat, but that was somewhat uncomfortable. Mr. Nonsense lives, as you might very well expect, in a country called Nonsense Land. Now, I know somebody else who lives in Nonsense Land. Do you? I think we do. We met him before. That's right, Mr. Silly. We did meet him ages ago. Mr. Silly and Mr. Nonsense were close friends and saw a lot of each other. Mr. Nonsense was often round at Mr. Silly's house playing jigsaw puzzles. They used to throw the pieces at each other. How silly. And Mr. Silly was often round at Mr. Nonsense's house playing cards. They used to tear them up to see who could get the most pieces out of one card. What nonsense! However, this story is about the time it snowed in Nonsense Land. It didn't very often snow, but one winter it did. Now tell me, what colour is snow? It's white, you're right. Oh, there's the picture. No, in Nonsense Land, when it snows, it doesn't snow white snow. It snows yellow snow. Don't ask me why, but it does. Yellow snow. And when Mr. Silly woke up one morning, the whole of Nonsense Land was covered. I say, he said when he looked out of his bedroom window, snow! And he was so excited he rushed round to Mr. Nonsense's house. Mr. Nonsense was asleep in his boat. Wake up, cried Mr. Silly. Wake up and come and look out of the window. Whatever on earth is it? Grumbled Mr. Nonsense, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes as he got up and went across to his bedroom window. I say, he said, looking out, custard! That isn't custard, you silly banana, cried Mr. Silly. That's snow. He rushed downstairs. Come on, he called. And that day Mr. Silly and Mr. Nonsense had one of the best days of their lives. They had a snowball fight. Mr. Silly's snowballs were round Mr. Nonsense made snowballs that somehow or other came out sort of square. How silly. They built a snowman, a very silly, nonsensical sort of snowman. Come on, said Mr. Nonsense that afternoon. Let's go tobogganing. But we don't have a toboggan, said Mr. Silly. Oh no, we don't, agreed Mr. Nonsense. Mr. Silly thought. Oh yes, we do, he said. And Mr. Silly ran back into Mr. Nonsense's house and came back with his bed. Whee! They shouted together as they slid faster and faster down the hill in their rowing boat toboggan. It was a wonderful day, and that evening, after having supper together, porridge pie, Mr. Nonsense suggested that they played a game. What shall we play? Asked Mr. Silly. Draughts, replied Mr. Nonsense. I've forgotten how to play draughts, said Mr. Silly. Oh, it's easy, replied Mr. Nonsense. I wonder how they play it. And went round and opened all the doors and windows. There we are, he said. Draughts. What nonsense. I do really like that book. It's a great one. So today, boys and girls, our rhyme is Little Bo Peep. So at the moment, if you check the website, loads of baby lambs have been born beside me. So I thought a few of the rhymes we did this week could be about lambs. So that's why we did Baba Black Sheep, Mary Mary Quite Contrary, and this is our third one about sheep, Little Bo Peep. So I'll count 3 and then we can start. 1, 2, 3. Little Bo Peep lost her sheep and doesn't know where to find them. Leave them alone and they will come home wagging their tails behind them. Hooray! Well done, boys and girls. I loved our stories and our rhymes this week, and I'm looking forward to starting them again on Monday. I hope you all have a lovely weekend, and I hope I hear from some of you to hear what you've been up to, and I love getting photographs. They're probably my favourite thing I love getting. So send me in photographs and tell me what you're up to. I'll talk to you on Monday.